Thanks for inviting me here to give some input here today. And there's lots and lots and lots of information. And unfortunately, because of time limits, and I'm going to be really selective on what I present. You have my testimony, which is much more extensive. So hopefully you folks will go either have or will go through that in detail. Good people are all impacted by the tragedies that we see, both the injury and death of innocent lives. And it's natural for us to react by grief. I mean, that is a natural process, a response that's built into us in order for us to be able to process extremely disturbing kinds of occurrences. And the reaction to the loss, it's a loss of innocent life, but it's also a loss of our particular way of seeing the world. A world that was safe and secure, and that becomes shattered. A very smaller version of that is if you ever had your house burglarized, and there's a real loss there. Now, the reason I bring this up is that during the grief process, there are certain kinds of things operating. There's denial, there's anger, there's bargaining. These are Kubler-Ross's stages. And anger, for example, during this time looks for a target. It looks for a place to focus, a place to blame. Two of the targets, so to speak, of anger during this period are mental illness and firearms, including firearm owners. And then there's bargaining. In the bargaining stage, we're just willing to do anything to have life go back to normal, to have the trauma stop. And there's also a lot of pressure on our legislators to save us from this, which puts all of you in a position that's quite impossible. I mean, you're essentially being asked to legislate human evil, make that go away, and that's been with us since the beginning of human history. That's been with us well before firearms, even before metal. Archaeologists that have unearthed thousands of years old human remains found that 40% of the deaths were homicides. So we need to be careful in bargaining what we're willing to do and what we're willing to give up. You know, there's that saying, be careful what you wish for. I mean, do you really want to agree to something that destroys basic constitutional protections that we have of our individual liberty and the consequences that go with that? So, I just add this to to kind of put the whole discussion into context. And the pressure on legislators, save us. Well, we have approximately 30,000 laws regulating firearms. Is the 30,000th and one finally going to do the trick? It's important to not jump to simplistic, knee-jerk emotional responses. If you're in the anger phase, you're dominated by stress hormones, you can't really reflect, you can't really consider the larger picture, and so that's not a good time to make major decisions. I think your comment, Senator Baker, that you had when you sent around notice that we need to really take a close look at what's been effective. We can't just pass laws just to appease emotions. I thought that was an extremely appropriate comment. So, one of the blame targets is mental illness, and that's really reasonable to understand why that's so. These situations are so horrific, they're so out of the range of normal human experience that the first response is the person must have been a madman. No one else could possibly do what was done except a madman. The common public perception, I think you've heard this several times, but I'm going to repeat it again. The common public perception of linking mental illness and violence is a gross misperception. The best research we have shows that those with mental illness are responsible for only 3 to 5% of overall violence. And that's what I think is important. Whenever we talk about violence, why do we make up words and just talk about this area here? We need to talk about what do we do about overall violence. And that's the same thing for suicide. I mean, suicide is definitely a mental health problem. It's not a firearm problem. It just so happens that in the United States, a significant percentage of the suicides are committed with a firearm. But if you take, that's an N of 1. Anybody that does research knows that a research with an N of 1, that is a group of 1, only the United States, can tell you some things, but it really misses a lot of other things, a lot of really other important points and important information that can inform your decisions about things. It can inform your overall perspective. So if you take a look internationally, what you find is that countries that have far greater restrictions on firearms, far, far greater, to the extent that you'd have difficulty finding a firearm in somebody's, in common people's home, still have high rates of violence. They have high rates of mass murders. And they also have high rates of suicide. Lithuania, for example, if you saw in my graph, has only 0.8% of the firearms that are available, that the United States have. And yet, our suicide rate is here, along with most of the rest of the world. Lithuania is up here. If firearms aren't available as they are not in other countries, other methods are used. The issue is to respond to people. Why do you feel you need to commit suicide? Why is that the only answer? Rather than just focusing on one particular object.
Dr. Gallo, I was hopeful that I have to testify at another Senate hearing.
Okay, you want me to wrap things up really quickly?
Very shortly, and I would like to hear Dr. Lott's
okay.
condensed version as well. And I generally don't like to interrupt someone, but there's a closure of a state facility in my home.
You do have my full
area.
testimony.
We do.
I did provide
We do.
everybody with the book. And one of the main questions that I ask, that I have not heard being asked, is why now? When we've had mental health problems in the past, when we had greater firearm access prior to 1968, we didn't have the level of violence, and we didn't have the juvenile and young killings. Why is it happening now? What are the factors that are propelling the violence? It's important to look at the source. And mass media, violent media, is a major, major source. There's over 1,000 studies that show cause and an effect, not correlation. And I also included an alternative, an option, Take the Challenge, which is a media literacy education program that can be used in the schools, kindergarten through high school, and the director is willing to meet with any of our legislators or any of our school personnel. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lott. I appreciate it, and if I have to duck away, I hope you'll understand. But I'm trying to stay here so I can hear your actual testimony. I did read your written testimony. Thank you.
I greatly appreciate your time. Appreciate being invited.
Could you please press the microphone so we can hear?
I greatly appreciate your time and being invited. My comments are not going to involve the written testimony that I have. I want to mainly talk about the testimony that's been given by others today so far here. We all want to stop people being killed. We all want to try to reduce violence. But a lot of the numbers that have been given here are kind of misinterpretations or not understanding how numbers are put together. So take something like automobile deaths. One thing that'd be easy for people to go and check is just pull up a graph that shows how automobile deaths per mile driven have changed since 1920. They were falling dramatically before the federal government got involved and started issuing regulations in '67. In fact, if you look at that, the rate of decline was actually slower after the federal government got involved than it was beforehand. And there's a simple reason for that. Companies were putting out safety actions, collapsible steering columns, shatterproof glass, seat belts. They were competing against each other. When the federal government got involved, everybody had to wait for the federal government to go and put out a safety regulation, because when the government would do it, it wouldn't just say airbags. It would say you have to make the airbags, make them in a particular way. They have to use certain chemicals. They have to be installed in certain places. And the government's not fast in putting things out. And what would happen is a company would say, do we go and put airbags in our cars, or do we wait for the government to do it? They'd all wait for the government, because otherwise they'd be spending hundreds of millions of dollars and waiting for the government to do it, and then they have to rip up everything and redo it. And rather than wasting all that money, they would wait for the government and actually slow down dramatically the rate that safety improvements occur. We heard from a couple doctors a few minutes ago, and they were talking about the horrible tragedies that they observe on a first-hand basis that's there. What you have to realize is there's lots of tragedies that are avoided that they don't see. We can't just count the tragedies that are there. 95% of the times that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is sufficient to cause a criminal to stop the attack. What would happen, people who use guns to protect themselves, they have stories too about what would have happened if they had been able to go and protect themselves. Mental illness is a really serious problem, and a lot of the people have talked about that. But I think we need some perspective about things that can work. So for example, if you look at the cases since 1998, 45% of the mass public shooters in the United States were actually seeing mental health care professionals within 6 months of their attack. And yet, in not one single case do these mental health care professionals identify these killers as being a danger to themselves or a danger to others. In fact, there's a large academic literature out there among psychologists and psychiatrists to explain their inability to go and identify these individuals beforehand. And there's lots of reasons. We've related to some things about the rarity of violent crime committed by people with mental health issues, and also the fact that these individuals are fairly smart and know what to say to the mental health care professionals. So an example of how smart they are is just the amount of planning that you see on the part of these individuals. 6 months is a short amount of time. It's very common to see 1 or 2 or even 2.5 years involved in the planning. Just an example of that is 94% of the mass public shootings in the United States occur in gun-free zones. These individuals want to kill as many people as possible, and they know if they pick a place where victims are less able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be more successful in doing it. They want to kill as many people as possible in order to get more media coverage that's there. There are things I could go on about Monday morning quarterbacking and false positives and the fact that these mental health individuals are more likely to be victims of violent crime, so there's a benefit for them being able to go and defend themselves also. But there's lots of issues that have come up today in terms of numbers. So for example, since 1998, 15% of the mass public shooters have been under 21. You know, that question's been raised multiple times during the hearing here. The median age is 34 of these mass public shooters. The actual number of attacks over the last 20 years has been fairly flat in an individual year. The number of fatalities have increased over the last few years, but the actual rate of attacks, if you use the FBI traditional definition of 4 or more people killed in a public place, not involving some other type of crime like a gang fight or something like that, has actually been fairly flat. Now, one thing that's been brought up many times during the hearing today has been cross-country comparisons. And the thing is, we rarely hear about mass public shootings that occur in other countries. I'll give you a simple example. Everybody knows about the New Zealand attack, but do you know within less than 24 hours of that, there was a big mass public school shooting in Brazil? Do you know that there was a mass public shooting in the Netherlands that had occurred also within 24 hours? If France, in 1 year, 2015, had more casualties from mass public shootings than the United States had during the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency. And they've continued to have them every year. If you look at a per capita rate, published peer-reviewed research that I had earlier this year showed that you have many countries, France, Russia, Finland, Norway, Switzerland, other European countries, major European countries, lots of smaller ones too, that have death rates from mass public shootings using the FBI definition, which are substantially higher rates than we have here in the United States. They just don't get news coverage in the United States when these things go and happen in other countries. If you look at the 90 countries that we're able to identify mass public shooting cases, on a per capita rate, the United States ranks 65th among those countries. If you look at guns and homicide across countries, whether you look at all countries or you look at developed countries, the countries with the highest gun ownership rates tend to have the lowest homicide rates. If you look at mass public shootings, you see the same relationship. The countries with the highest gun ownership rates tend to have the lowest rates of mass public shootings or fatalities from mass public shootings. We heard about research for suicides involving countries like Australia, Switzerland, and Israel. Well, you have to understand it's the same type of mistakes that are made in the motor vehicle death data that I was talking about before. Take Australia, for example. In the 15 years prior to the buyback that they had in 96 and 97, firearm suicides were falling. They continued falling afterwards. But just make a simple graph in your mind where it's perfectly straight line over the entire period of time. Any period that you pick, the after average would be below the before average. That's what everybody compares, is the after average and before average. What you really want to do is see, did the rate of decline increase? Did it slow down? Was there some discontinuity that occurred in that straight line that you were having? And what you find in the case of Australia is that firearm suicides, the rate of decline actually slowed down after they had the buyback. The same with firearm homicides. Non-firearm suicides actually went up in Australia. There's been a lot of research by economists and criminologists that have looked at issues such as suicide, and what you find is that when you look at total suicides, virtually no one is finding evidence that total suicides fall as a result of that. Arthur Berg at Harvard, Gary Mauser at Simon Fraser University, and myself, we just finished a survey, the largest survey that's been done of academics who have published peer-reviewed academic research on firearm policy in any way. And what we have found is that the vast majority of academics are very skeptical that red flag laws or universal background checks or bans or taxes or other types of policies are going to have any impact on any type of murder rates or mass public shootings. The one group that finds one type of policy seems to be particularly effective is economists believe that getting rid of gun-free zones would be by far the most effective way of doing it. We want to go and try to stop bad guys from getting guns. The issues that you have here is that the major source of illegal guns are drug dealers. And the notion that you're going to be any more successful in stopping criminals from getting a hold of illegal guns than you've been able to stop them from getting a hold of illegal drugs just isn't very serious. You can look at Mexico. Mexico this year is going to be having a homicide rate 6 times what we have in the United States. Since 1972, there's been one gun store in the country. It's run by the military, very costly, 6-month background check to be able to go and buy a gun. Only about 1% of Mexicans legally own a gun in that country. And yet, there's big profits for having illegal drugs. And they bring in weapons from around the world in order to protect that property. A drug gang in the United States can't go to the police and say, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? They have to go and set up their own militaries. If you were to go and click your fingers and cause all illegal drugs in the United States to disappear and all guns, how quickly do you think illegal drugs would be coming back into the United States? If you're in El Paso, 20 minutes? How long do you think it would be before they would bring in the weapons that they need to go and protect that very valuable property that they have there? And so when 70% of the deaths are suicides and a large portion of the remaining other deaths are involving drug gangs that are there, you have to realize that if we eliminated the guns, the suicides, the vast majority of research, as I was saying, would find no impact on total deaths, and you'd have very limited effect on the others. You'd have to eliminate the profits for the drug gangs to go and deal with that. I appreciate your time.
Doctors, I want to thank you both for being here. That concludes the testimony before the committee for today. We will have a second hearing tomorrow in this same room. Room 1 of the North Office Building at 1 p.m. So we will recess the Senate Judiciary Committee to the call of the chair. And I want to thank everyone for their participation and the respectful testimony that has been presented. Thank you so much.